William, thank you very much for being a guest today.
That's all right. It's all right. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, as always, I'm going to begin with my Inside the Actor Studio questionnaire. Uh, what is your favorite word?
Ooh, that's a very good question. All right. I'll go for an obvious one. I'll go for anti-disestablishmentarianism.
I'm pretty sure someone has said that before, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
Uh, what is your least favorite word?
Hmm. Weird.
What is your favorite swear word?
What can I say? What can I say? I'll go with crap.
Has British politics caused you to use it much over the last year?
It's certainly been frustrating. I think watching people fall into fairly obvious traps over and over again on all sides. But yeah, I'm hopeful that things are perhaps beginning to turn around.
What is the sound of noise that you love?
Ooh, well, my recently departed cat's purr.
Uh, that's I'm very sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. But yes, no, she had a long 17-year life. I really can't complain.
What is the sound of noise that you hate?
Um, Probably the sound of the motorbikes going past my open window when I'm trying to sleep at about 3 a.m.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Ooh, I mean, guilty pleasure. I guess the closest I'd say to a guilty pleasure is probably Doctor Who. Not because I'm particularly guilty about it, but just because I don't know. It's the only TV show that I really still watch, to be honest.
What is your favorite book?
Oh, oh, that's a very hard question. Fiction, it's a bit of an obvious one, but fiction is Lord of the Rings. I've read it God knows how many times over the years. Although I'm also a huge Song of Ice and Fire fan as well. Non-fiction, probably the Third Reich trilogy by Richard Evans. He all three of those are coming Third Reich in Power, Third Reich at War. They're partly what got me into modern history when I was undergraduate. Incredible trilogy. Still probably the best English language summary history of Nazi Germany from its beginning until its end.
In so I love and I've always loved the Lord of the Rings films.
Hmm.
Um, but I never actually read the books. And then
Really? No, you should.
yeah, yeah.
You should.
Well, so I was several weeks ago. I was staying with a friend, and it was his birthday, and his brother had given him uh some new hardback editions of the trilogy. Uh,
Yeah.
and they were on his dining table, and I just opened the Two Towers
Hmm.
and started reading, and I was gripped because in my head I'd had this idea that Tolkien is a very dense uh, writer, like very heavy, almost Homeric
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
writer. And then it was sort of it opened with the scene with the Urukai
Yeah.
and Boromir, and I was amazed at like how well and how lightly it was written.
Yeah. No, he. I mean, it's one of those things where it's very weird talking about Tolkien as someone who's kind of a fan of modern fantasy because Tolkien, despite obviously there's a lot of people who try to imitate him, he's almost not really writing novels. He's writing mythology and but also writing fairy stories at the same time. And it's a way of writing that you only get if you spent most of your life studying like ancient myths and fairy tales and that. So it's so difficult to imitate. As you say, it's so rich and so layered, it's also just really funny. I mean, they cut a lot of it out of the films for understandable reasons, but the whole joke in Fellowship is that the Shire is this kind of tiny provincial Middle England kind of village where everyone's kind of peeking in on each other and really parochial and really obsessed with each other's lives, and it's funny and humorous and tragic and absolutely brilliant. I love it.
And finally, is there a fictional character who you'd like to imagine yourself to be?
Ooh. I was prepared for this one because you said the same thing in the Carcassian one. I guess I've always thought in terms of I mean, if I wanted to be, there's a few, but I guess in terms of like more broadly like relating, I've always thought, have you read Discworld?
No.
much Pratchett. I'd say the three of the main characters in the City Watch books, Captain Vimes, Patrician Vetinari, and then Carrot, Private Carrot. I feel like I relate to all of those three, and out of the three of them, I want to be Vimes the most.
What's he like?
I like his stubbornness, his desire to do good at all costs, but at the same time, his willingness to, it's that line. I can't remember where I ever got it from, but it's justice is blind, not heartless. It's that sense of you do what is right and just, but you don't focus on that to the end, the be all end all of everything else. So in that situation,
So I thought I'd begin by asking, what, in your view, is the state of British politics right now?
I think the state of British politics, if you take a kind of a broader look, there's I think two main stories that are kind of going on. One is an element of the chickens coming home to roost, of a lot of problems, a lot of decisions that have been made since I'd say about 2008. It's a combination of the economic crisis, the great financial crisis, which hasn't really been fully recovered from, if I'm going to be honest, I don't think. And as a result of that, decisions that were made, especially from 2010 onwards, but not just from then, that have things, whether we're talking about austerity, whether we're talking about underinvestment, whether we're talking about stagnant wages or rising house prices that wages aren't catching. Things which are a combination of both long and medium term factors that are now kind of all hitting at once. And I think COVID really didn't help with that. And that's kind of the long term structural problems. There's also the political problems, which is, I think, we've seen the rise of kind of populism across, well, the developed world, not just America and Europe, but South Korea. We've seen that as well, and I think that's linked structurally with the problems. But also, I think, and I've been more and more convinced of this actually, that this goes back to the end of the Cold War. That without kind of unified or unifying opposition to liberal democracy, you're seeing these democracies internally kind of splitting into more and more radical forms. And I think that is not necessarily something that's going to continue. We've had periods like this in the past. I mean, the 1920s and 30s, to some extent, the 1980s as well, 70s and 80s. But I think that the end of the Cold War has, politically speaking, removed an obvious unifying factor within democracies, and frankly within societies more broadly, that I think we may end up looking back on the 20th century as less of a typical period for democracy than we maybe thought it was at the time.
I mean, that kind of touches on something that I've sort of thought about a lot and discussed intimately on the podcast, of like the breakdown of terminology over the last sort of 30 years of like, you will get people, you will see these descriptors in political commentary or analysis where it might be socially liberal, economically conservative,
Yes.
or economically left, culturally right.
Yeah.
But there is no term to describe those positions, as in one term of someone who is that. And it's kind of like we're all struggling to find new terminology to talk about politics as it is now.
I think that's actually a really interesting point, because one thing I was thinking, I've been talking a bit on Blue Sky about the sort of breakdown of the Tory party. I mean, it's one of the biggest stories in British politics, but it was interesting to me that when I was talking about this kind of move from kind of like liberal Tories towards the Lib Dems, I used this term red Tory or sort of yellow Tory, which is funny because I haven't heard that used aside from as a term of abuse for the last 10 years. That used to be a real thing. The idea of you'd have kind of centre left, not centre left, but like within the Tory party, centre left types who would be kind of red or yellow Tories who would have more in common in some respects with Labour or the Lib Dems on social issues. But that doesn't really exist anymore. That whole sort of faction, I haven't really heard that term used since the Miliband era. So I know what you mean. There is this sense of And I think the other problem is that when we think about kind of these sort of eras in the past that had these big terminologies, we're often talking about leaders and their followers, right? We're talking about kind of Blairism or Thatcherism, Thatcherite, Blairite, and we haven't really had a major political figure like that who has been able to, reconfigure British politics around them and their project really since Blair. And Blair was what 20 years ago now. That's when he left office. So it's actually we haven't really seen the replacement of the old with the new at this point, and I do wonder if we are coming towards some kind of crunch point for that, where the whole sort of the old is dying, the new is struggling to be born. In the interregnum, a great number of morbid symptoms appear. I do wonder if we are coming towards a point where somebody is going to end up kind of either by design or by accident becoming that next figure.
I mean, similar to that, something I find is uh, maybe this has always been the case, but I don't know. But when political journalists cover contemporary politics, the actions of politicians, and maybe also the people in politics actively do this. But whatever they do, whether it's a speech or a policy intervention
Yeah.
or anything like that, they are framed as emulating things from the political past. So
Yes.
whether it is, this is Keir Starmer's Clause 4 moment. Um,
Yeah.
this is Cami Badenoch's, Bruce speech. Like, it's
Yeah.
all very much 20, 30, 40-year-old political events. And it doesn't seem like no new iconic events are being invented.
Absolutely. And I think it's strange, actually, isn't it? Because there have been so many incredibly kind of like shocking political events over the last 10 years. I mean, you just think back to the Brexit years, 2016 to 2019. There's an excellent podcast series on past, present, future with Robert Saunders, where they do like the general election of and do a podcast on these really important general elections. And they did one on 1906, 1997, 1979, and they did one on 2019. And it was fascinating because I had completely forgotten so much about that period. I recall the prorogation of Parliament, but the whole lead up to that and the way that kind of segued into the election and all of the manoeuvring around the first Johnson administration, I had completely forgotten all of that. And I do think that that's partly the COVID effect, actually, has knocked out of people's minds a lot of recent political history because it's just overwhelmed everything else. It's like the entire period from 2019 until now feels like COVID, Partygate, Ukraine, and then that's more or less it. But no, I agree, and it's interesting as well because you see this in kind of when you see people talking about sort of like the whole idea of the uniparty, right? Or like, oh, Labour and the Tories are so similar, and you think like, no, they aren't, and they haven't been for a long time actually. I mean, really, last time you could make any sort of argument like that was 2017, and again, that was at this point 7 years ago. Actually, Labour and the Tories have been diverting for a long time, but people just sort of seem to be stuck in this assumption that like, oh, actually, no, it's still New Labour. And actually, it really isn't. A lot has changed since then. But yeah, there's a real issue with like updating the priors, I think, and I'm realizing actually no, we are in a very different period than we were even 5 years ago.
Something I've thought for a long time is I think I first came up with this phrase in like university or something, but basically, politics is the delayed reaction to past events. That um, by the time politicians, politicos, political
Yeah.
journalists scramble to react to an event, something has already happened, and we've already moved on from whatever it is they're responding to. And I feel like that's true for a lot of the people will talk about politics, the current political environment, but they're actually talking about a political environment that existed 5 years ago. Um, and they struggle to fit whatever's happening now into how they understood it several years ago.
I think, I mean, That reminds me of that quote. Is it, I think it's attributed to Napoleon, whether it is him or not. I'm not sure, but it's like, it's like, if you want to find out why a man is the way he is, find out what was happening in the world when he was 20. And it's that sort of idea, and I think that that is true to an extent. Like, people become, they are defined, I think, and this is actually to slightly go off topic here. This is my big problem with a lot of the discussion around generations, because a generation, to me, it's not just a set period of time. It's a period of time where a person has been influenced by a major event in their life. Like, I guess, depending on how you define it, I'm either a very, very, very young millennial or a very, very, very old Gen Z. But like, to me, like, the millennial generation, which I always think is slightly older than me, is defined by the financial crisis and by the reaction to that. That is what defines that generation. In the same way, actually, as I think Gen Alpha is defined by COVID. That's their defining aspect of their generation. It isn't just like time moving on, it's actually important events happening and how you're defined by that. And I think that, for a lot of people around my age, that defining moment was Brexit. That in the UK, that was like, I was 18, 19 when Brexit happened. So, that was like the moment where I think a lot of my political, not even like my views, but like that was like my introduction to, oh, politics actually matters and it can directly affect your life in a way you didn't necessarily understand that it could beforehand.
What's interesting about that is so being a millennial, a key shift in my political thinking uh, wasn't the financial crisis, which
Okay.
happened when I was 18, 19.
Yeah.
Um, it was actually Brexit.
Okay.
Because up until Brexit, I was a pretty conventional sort of liberal Tory
Mm.
that had, you know, always supported the Tory party as long as I can remember. And it was actually Brexit that caused the break in my thinking. And it was a sort of combination of things. So at the time, in 2015, 2014, 2015, I had managed a parliamentary campaign in
Mm.
Southport, and I'd taken the candidate from about 10% behind the Lib Dem incumbent to within about 1,300 votes. And that involved, like, there was no money, there was no organizational structure. So within about 7 months, we managed to get, 1,300 votes short.
Yeah.
So it was the view of like local party people. Given I'd done that, they would drop me into a council race um, where the local party, everyone despised each other. Um, and couldn't agree on anything. For the first time ever, I'd come across not only constituency chairman, party chairman, but a ward party chairman. And that was basically a result of the two of them hating each other. Um, and and so basically I was seen as like an option to, like, given I'd wrangled the Southport party, I
Yeah.
managed to get those cats to walk into a line. They thought I could do it there, maybe win. So they did. Um, and it was some of the worst several months of my life. Um, and all happening at the same time as the start of the referendum campaign. Beforehand, I was like kind of pro Europe, but like not in any kind of
Mm. Yeah.
partisan way. And I think even up to like late 2015, I was kind of the view of, Europe shouldn't fracture the unity of the Tory party. The unity of the Tory party should come first. And then it was like the combination of both the referendum campaign, Russia very much being in favor of Britain leaving the EU, the wider strategic consequences of it, and dealing with a local Tory party that was insane. Um, those things kind of came to a point where I was like, I don't actually care about the success of the Tory party anymore. I care more about Britain's place in Europe and Europe's place in the world and sort of everything like that. And so for me, that caused a shift that actually nothing else had before. And I sort of found myself the Tory party going much more right
Yeah.
and me going much more left, all because of the referendum.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. Certainly, I very much relate to the, and actually I've mentioned this before. I think I'm not sure how publicly or not, but the this idea of like being kind of pro Europe in a sort of soft sort of sense, to then after the election result switching to a much more ideological, I guess, commitment, not necessarily to the EU, but to the idea of Europe. I saw that happen with a lot of people, especially younger people. I think, the one of the interesting things I think about Brexit is that in many ways it was the birth of the pro-Europe movement in the UK. Again, obviously, I can't speak to the 70s, I can't speak to the period of the common market, but certainly actually, Stephen Bush, the FT, has pointed this out a number of times. I think he's totally right to. If you go back and you look at the European parliamentary elections in the UK, from at least 1999, arguably 1994, because Labour at that point was arguably more Eurosceptic, but at least since 1999, the party that won the European parliamentary elections in the UK was always the Eurosceptic party. It was either the Tories, and then later it was UKIP, and of course the Brexit Party in 2019. And and for most of those results as well, if you're looking at like both the Tories and UKIP together, you're getting an overwhelming majority that is Eurosceptic in those elections. And his argument actually is that, like, considering how Eurosceptic British culture was in the 90s and 2000s, actually it's the only real issue, the only real wonder with Brexit is that actually it Remain did so well. And I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about it. That actually maybe a lot of the ways that more kind of liberal types think about Brexit, it needs to be put on its head. Actually, the campaign did very well, and actually perhaps rather than thinking about the campaign, you need to think about the broadest kind of positioning of British society towards the EU over the last 30 years, and why actually it was a lot more Eurosceptic than you might have actually thought it was. But no, and I think that in a very real way, that those kind of general feelings of like kind of pro Europe, pro the single market, pro travel, pro business, kind of actually coalesced into a much more ideological sense of being pro EU, or at least pro Europe. And certainly, I mean, people have been asking the question, where did that all go, right? Because certainly since 2019, I mean, you had a million people out on the streets of London going for what do they call it? Something vote.
The second referendum.
Yeah, no, it wasn't actually directly that. They advertised it as being like a confirmatory vote or something. It could have been a referendum or something else, but yeah, most people probably were there for a second referendum. But but like from that to then kind of going to a situation now where actually the official, as it were, pro EU campaigns have mostly all died off. But I think a lot of that is actually going to do with COVID, and also to do with the fact that like that I would I think again we're in this period of great flux at the moment, and I don't think that until we know what's happening on the right wing, until we actually have a sense of whether reform is going to fully take over from the Tory party or not, I don't know. I just get the feeling that a lot of people are kind of hanging back and waiting to see how it all shakes out before they start deciding to do anything.
I think a problem with the way a lot of people are dealing with and interpreting British politics right now is kind of on this point that like everything's kind of in flux. I I think a lot of people between sort of political journalists and also people involved in politics underappreciate the full extent to which things are in flux and what that means for getting support. So, like,
Yes.
uh, if someone has voted reform before, it is not guaranteed that they will vote reform again. Um, Same for Labour voters, same for Tory voters, same for
Yeah.
LibDem voters.
They don't have
That
roses yet.
There's a several months ago, I did an interview with the behavioral scientist Nick Chater, and
Mm.
his sort of big argument is he wrote a really, really interesting book called The Mind is Flat, and his overarching argument is that we don't really have subconsciouses. There aren't like deep there aren't hidden beliefs and values in our brain that have sort of big foundations. Our brains are basically made up of sensory experiences, memories of past sensory experiences, and our imagination and fitting those two things together. And so people are much easier to change their mind than you might think. Uh, if you can uh, sort of take hold of those sensory experiences in the right way, and actually people can come up with justifications for why they should believe new things. Um, and I feel like that's kind of the situation of British politics right now. Of there are a lot of people who you don't really have two big Tory Labour voting blocks with a little bit in between swinging either way. You have a lot of people who are ideologically uncommitted, uh, and therefore it is open to anyone to persuade anyone of anything, so long as they can do it well. And their past voting behavior doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily key in what they might support in future.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of the kind of civic behavioural stuff, I don't have the expertise to comment on that, but I certainly think that there's quite a lot of opportunity, certainly at the moment. I think, yeah, a combination. I mean, it's difficult to talk about. Obviously, I think Brexit is a big part of it, certainly in the UK. But obviously, we're also seeing this happen across the more developed world. And I think certainly when you look back at the kind of 1950s, I think so. One thing that frustrates me actually when we talk about British politics is this idea of the two-party system. Right, people still talk about this. Actually, if you look at the broad trajectory of British politics since about 1832, what you actually see is the growth and collapse of a number of different party systems. Obviously, 1832 until about 1885 or so, you have the two-party system with the Liberals and the Conservatives, which is dominated by dominated by the Liberals. I mean, the Liberals win. I think it's something like between 1840 and 1885, they either get a majority or plurality of the vote in every single election, and the Conservatives only win through seats rather than through votes. And in 1886, of course, you have the breaking of the Liberal Party into the Liberals and the Liberal Unionists, who then ally with the Conservatives, and you have about a period from about 1886 until about 1906, when it's kind of Tory dominance. Then you have the Liberal landslide, 1906, and you have the First World War. And the First World War is really important because that collapses that system entirely. That two-party system collapses. It was already kind of on its way out, but it gets killed. And in the 1920s, you have this proliferation of new parties, obviously the Labour Party, most importantly, and the Co-op Party, which ends up aligning with Labour. But you also have the National Liberals, because the Liberals split again into the Liberals and National Liberals. And you have this period of kind of crisis in the 1920s, which actually is quite similar in some respects, I think, to what we're seeing now. And that leads into the national governments of the 30s, where you have all sorts of different parties all in these big governments, mostly led by the Conservatives. And then you get to 1945, and that really, especially for 1951, when the Liberal vote collapses again, that's when you have this actual two-party system. And from about 51 until, I think, 74, you really have Labour or Tories, and that's it. And yeah, okay, the Liberals still exist, but they're like on 7% of the vote or whatever. They're not doing much. And then you get into 1970s, and that's when you have the Liberal revival under Thorpe. And then, of course, you get into the 80s and you have the SDP Liberal Alliance. So at that point, you have a three-party system from about 74 going up until maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. And then you start seeing the rise of the more kind of radical right parties, like UKIP most prominently. And also you start seeing the uptick of the Green Party as well in the late 2000s. So by the point that we're at now, and yeah, again, that the Lib Dems kind of keep a lot of that anti-establishment vote in themselves in the 2000s, and then when they collapse in 2015, that all gets splayed out across the different parties. So really, at this point, if we're excluding Northern Ireland, just looking at Great Britain, at a Great Britain level, we're about a five-party system at this point. We've got the Tories, Labour, Lib Dems, Reform, and Greens, plus the nationalists in Scotland and Wales, so Plaid and the SNP, that's without even looking at Northern Ireland. So one of these kind of political memes that I really dislike is this idea of the two-party system. We haven't been a two-party system since the 1980s, and yet people still talk about it like we are. And I get why, because it's been, there's only the Tories and Labour have been the main party in each government from that point forward. But it's not a very useful way of thinking about this, because talking as if this period that we're going through is a period that is kind of incomparable in British politics. It really isn't. You can go back to the 20s and you can just look at that. And the big difference, though, of course, in the 20s is that the Tories remained united as the left wing vote split. But now we're not seeing that. We're seeing the right wing vote split and the left wing vote split. So to kind of pull this back around, I don't think this is just specifically a British thing. I don't think it's just to do with Brexit, and I don't think it's just with COVID either, although COVID clearly hasn't helped. But we are seeing a fracturing and a splintering of political of the electorates across different parties, across, again, developed democracies. And, but at the same time, I don't think this is a new phenomenon. I think this is a reworking of an older thing, which feels to me like the end of one kind of political system and perhaps the slow beginnings of another. Although what that looks like is anyone's guess. I wouldn't put any money on anything at the moment.
I mean, we first started sort of engaging on Blue Sky over the idea of the Tory party in crisis and the potential of the Lib Dems overtaking them as official opposition. And I was really struck by something you wrote several months ago, that a lot of people talk about the Tories as the natural party of government,
yes,
which is very much based on the history in the 20th century.
Yeah.
But actually, you said in the 21st century, the Tory party has either lost most elections or only gotten a slim majority, except for 2019. 2019
yes.
is a standout, and that actually
Yes.
has either been loss, hung parliament, or small majority. And last year, I did an interview with the former Tory MP, Damien Collins.
Oh, yeah.
And I put to him this idea of, could the Lib Dems supplant the Tories? And his sort of counter was, there are centre-left solutions to policy problems. There are centre-right solutions to policy problems. There isn't really a Lib Dem answer to the NHS, immigration, anything like that. Labour supplies the centre-left solution. The Tories supply the centre-right solution. That's how it was in the 20th century. That's how it will continue in the 21st century. And my feeling is that it isn't guaranteed that the Tories are the centre-right vehicle for providing those solutions.
Well, I think so. To kind of take the two strands of that. I mean, so first of all, yes. In fact, I'll shameless plug here. It's my article. Tory decline has a longer history than you think. But yes. So I note in that article the point that of the 8 elections since 1997, the Tories have only gained a majority in 2. Labour gained a majority in 4. And of those elections, Labour majority since 97, I mean, you've had 179 seats in 97, 165 in 2001, 66 in 2005, and 174 in 2024. And in that period, the Tories have had a majority of 10 in 2015 and a majority of 80 in 2019. And the reason why we often forget this is because the Tories have been in government since 2010. But of those 14 years, two parliaments, one official coalition with the Lib Dems, and one was a confidence and supply agreement with the DUP, which ultimately brought down Theresa May. So about half of the entire period of Tory governance has been in coalition or in confidence and supply, because the Tories have lacked the electoral strength to actually gain a majority. And yes, they gained the majority in 2019. Now that's partly because Farage did basically stand down in those Tory seats. Now, Reform have tried to claim there was some kind of official pact. Now, as far as I can tell, that just isn't true. There was an official pact between Farage and Johnson. I do think that had Farage stood in those Tory seats, Johnson would still have won a majority, but nowhere near as big as 80, more like 30. So, it's not that I don't think he would have won at all, but I think it's undeniable that, the biggest Tory majority since 87 was won, at least in part, because Farage was willing to stand down. And in fact, to jump off from that as well, there's one of the things that you see happening in the 2010s onwards is a slow decoupling of local and European elections, Tory voters from the Tories, and moving towards UKIP. In 2013, 23% of the vote in the elections goes to UKIP. In 2024, the European elections, 27%, I think it was, goes to UKIP. And then in 2019, of course, 30% in the European parliamentary elections goes to Reform. But the national Tory vote isn't necessarily seeing that split yet. And then when we get to 2024, and now more in 2025, the local elections, that's when you're seeing that vote that was kind of Farage curious from the Tories has now fully gone to Farage. They've stopped splitting their vote between the Tories and Farage, and they've now just gone full Farage. So that's a big part of this. And I think that's really important because, the Tory party in the 20th century was a colossus. Even the SNP in Scotland in the 2010s arguably wasn't quite on the same level of dominance that the Tories had throughout most of the 20th century across the UK. But that has really shifted since 97. And I do think, to a very real extent, the story of British politics since 1997 is people on all sides not really recognising the massive shift that has happened in British politics since the mid-90s, and kind of not really knowing how to deal with that. On the right especially, but also on the left as well. But on the point particularly about the Lib Dems, I think I would be very careful as a Conservative to say anything about, well, this is the way it must be. As I mentioned before, the original party system, the Liberals and the Tories, was dominated by the Liberals, not the Conservatives. This sort of like 40 years of Tory. I mean, the idea of Gladstone being at the Treasury from 1860 till 1930. It was liberal ideas and liberal concepts that dominated British politics throughout most of the 19th and very early 20th century. Again, obviously that ended, but there's no reason that it can't happen again. And I think the assumption that things will always be the way they've been, well, I mean, we didn't even have a two-party system until the 1950s. The failure of the SDP Liberal Alliance in the 80s is very interesting in this regard. But had it been a different electoral system, that genuinely could have gone the other way, and Labour could have been supplanted by the SDP Liberal Alliance as the main centre-left option. So yeah, I would be very cautious about claiming that things have to be a certain way. But I also do think there is a fair argument in that the Lib Dems, historically and now, do lack a sense of governing mission, I would say. Certainly, I think there are policy ideas coming out of the Lib Dems that are more focused on specific, different ways to govern. But there's also always the issue of, not necessarily being the main centre-left option. The other thing I would say, though, is, and we've seen the Lib Dems move into this, I think, niche more recently, is it's not really an outcome that I necessarily think is the best option for them, but it's to more or less become the SNP of the Southeast, or certainly the SNP of the South, and to become a kind of vessel for the interests of the kind of liberal Southeast and Southwest. And that's, I think, to some extent, Davies' talk about becoming the main political, the taking over as the party of Middle England is, I think, partly an expression of that. Now, I do think that you run a risk if you do that of becoming more or less a kind of patchwork localist movement as opposed to an actual party. And it does, I think, stop you from expanding your base beyond that. I'm not sure it's a good outcome for the Lib Dems, but it's certainly an outcome that should worry the Tories because, part of the reason why you had Tory dominance in the southeast for so long was because people viewed them as an expression of their own interests as much as a policy platform. And if they stop being that, the Lib Dems could easily take that place. Especially if, as I find from talking to people back home, a lot of people in the southeast, and you saw this in the local elections, are more culturally Tory than they are culturally right wing. They don't like reform. They find reform scary. They find Farage scary. They don't like that kind of politics, and that comes up in the local election results. The southeast was one of the few places where you actually saw a split of the right wing vote between the Tories and Reform because people weren't comfortable just voting for Farage. So the Lib Dems have a real opportunity there to become both the anti-Farage party and the representation party, if that's what they want to do.
I kind of got into a discussion with Carl Cashman several months ago of the, as you've said, the strategic logic that Ed Davey ought to follow is building out this geographic base in the southeast, taking away yellow Tory votes, translating that into more seats, etc., etc. But Carl's view is that the Lib Dems shouldn't lose the centre-left heritage in doing that. And on the one hand, I think, is that feasible in offering both? And on the other hand, I sort of think, do not all parties face those choices? But the Lib Dems are expected to answer it in a way that neither the Tories, nor Labour, nor Reform are expected to answer it.
I think that's very true, actually, and I think it speaks to there's an idea, I think, certainly on parts of the right, and I think to some extent within the broader British media, that an insurgent party like Reform, which is of the right, is kind of like whatever it does, it's an honest expression of its voters. Whereas an insurgent party on the left, like the Lib Dems, or indeed the Greens, to be fair to them as well, are seen as having to justify everything that they do. There's an attempt to kind of pick holes in everything they do. Whereas the rise of Reform is seen as kind of like just a natural part of the world, And the thing is, there's an element always of, I think left-wing politics has a problem where people, there's always a sense of if you're trying to make things, if you're expressly trying to do a politics that isn't just about self-interest, there is an element of people kind of looking to poke holes in you because you're seen as kind of trying to give yourself airs. And I think that's just a fairly normal thing. You see it across the world, actually, with left-wing politics. The sense of, so there is an element of that. But I think also specifically with the Lib Dems, I think that there has been a notable shift, actually, in that, you look at the Lib Dems in the 2000s, and yes, they had more electoral strength than they do now. But it's not difficult to see that they weren't necessarily taking themselves as seriously as they could have been. You have this large, if diffuse, vote share. But you do also have a lot of, to sort of, at least to some extent, a sort of kind of student politics approach. This idea of like, we're going to get as many votes as we can by being all things to all men. And the problem with that, of course, is that when you're finally forced to choose, as they were in coalition, it all kind of comes crashing down. And I think what's happening is that a lot of people, particularly on the right, are looking at the Lib Dems now and are seeing them as still being that party of the 2000s. But I don't think they are, actually. I don't think they are at all. I think that they are putting together a very, very, very effective electoral machine and a very effective attempt to build out at least again, if you look at the map of the British local election results in 2025, what you see is, I actually mentioned it in my article as being a bit like a split between the old Anglo-Saxon Danelaw comparison, because the North and the Midlands, those councils up for election, go Reform, but the South-East and most of the South-West goes Lib Dem. And yes, okay, there's some exceptions. Obviously, Shropshire goes Lib Dem in the Midlands, and Kent goes Reform in the southeast, but you see this divide emerging between Reform and the Lib Dems. And interestingly, in a recent Politics Home article, Farage was quoted as saying the next general election would be a contest between reforms and the Lib Dem, what he called progressivism. Now, I think that's a bit overstating the point, and I think he's got his own reasons for saying that. But I do think that there is an element of the Lib Dems are, I think, a much harder political opponent now than they have been for a long time. And I think that certainly the Tories really underestimate them at their peril, to be honest, because if the Lib Dems can take, as it looks like they probably can do, another 20, 30 seats and crack 100, that could easily push the Tories down below them. And at that point, I think that you could genuinely see a wholesale flip, a wholesale break of the Tory vote between Reform and the Lib Dems, to be honest.
What could both Labour and the Tories do to get back to what the life that they're accustomed to?
I mean, I think this question is a lot easier to handle for Labour because Labour are in government. And actually, again, this is something that I mentioned people talked about the problems that Labour had at the local elections, and they are real problems. I mean, they got wiped out in Doncaster. They got wiped out in Durham. I mean, the Lib Dems are now the main centre-left party in Durham. Durham's been Labour since 1921. I mean, Labour or no overall control, but Labour is largest party. They have taken some staggering losses. At the same time, if you look at their the more high-profile elections, they kept all of their mayoralties, aside from Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. But that was partly because that voting system had changed. They would have lost it under if that voting system had been in place for the previous election as well. And they ran Reform within 6 votes of taking the by-election, which frankly was better than I thought they would do. So I think what that shows is there is a hardcore Labour vote that will show up for those more high-profile elections, but is willing to sit it out in protest at the council elections. Doesn't mean Labour can be complacent at all, but I think that shows actually that there is a willingness to turn out for those high-profile elections that will help them, I think, going into the next election. I think that, to be honest, the biggest problem Labour has is they have disappointed a lot of people in a lot of different ways. They disappointed a lot of socially liberal people, and that's the real problem because unlike in the 2000s, that's a real section of the Labour vote now. Like centre-left liberals are big enough that you can't ignore them if you're trying to be the main centre-left party. So you see a lot of that on social media, and again, I think it's showing up in the polling results as well. I mean, Labour's vote share amongst younger people has collapsed. I think I saw a month or so ago that actually now the Lib Dems were leading amongst younger people, which you wouldn't have expected that even a year ago. I mean, not by much, but they were leading. So I think that's a big problem for them. I think obviously and things like the PRP payments. Disability payments, obviously the winter fuel allowance, but a complete fiasco. They disappointed a lot of their voters while not being really able to shout about their genuine successes. I think Starmer's done very well on foreign policy. Not enough made of that. Breves genuinely put together a very centre-left budget. Whether you like it or not, she raised taxes. She has put a lot of money towards public services. Not enough made of that. The main focus has been on the negatives and firefighting. That being said, I'm unsure whether Labour can get back to the halcyon days of 40% of the vote. That I'm not sure about, but I think they can probably get it back to at least around 30 to 35%. But again, it's partly an issue of policy, but it's also partly an issue of publicising the policy that you actually make. The Tories, I don't know. I mean, again, I say in my article, like, I went to bed after the local election results genuinely thinking that maybe the Tories are just done, because I don't know how you come back from this in opposition without. I mean, changing leader maybe, but the problem I think for the Tories is that unlike Labour, they've never had to fight to be the centre-right option. They've had to fight to win against Labour and the Liberals before them, but they've never had competition on their right that they couldn't absorb. You had the liberal unionists and the national liberals in the 20s and 30s, but those were break-offs from the Liberal Party. They were small parties by design, and they were relatively easily merged into the Tory Party as it exists. What we're seeing now is the opposite: the rise of a centre-right party, or in the Reform's case, a right-wing party, that is looking to totally subsume the Tories. And they've not dealt with that before. And they're not really in a good position to deal with it now. The main thing I would suggest if I was advising the Tory party is to say, look, go back and look at what you did in the 50s, right? In the 40s and 50s, when, Labour comes in 45 with this massive landslide and reshapes British society around in its own image with the NHS and expansion of the welfare state and national industries and all of that. And then what you see in post that period is this massive period of enthusiasm in the Tory party, where they spend the next 5 years basically hashing out a way that they can come to terms with and deal with the change in British society that happens in that period. And then they get back in 51, and they're able to, basically continue the post-war consensus, but slant it in such a way that it's acceptable to them and their voters and their interests. And what I see in 97 is that doesn't really happen. The Tories don't really go through that period of really internalising and understanding why Blair won, why the centre-left was triumphant during the 2000s, and why they have been historically weak in the 21st century. And I think they need to do that. I mean, maybe it's too late, but they need to do that now more than ever. Really deeply engage with what they got wrong, why they ended up out in the cold, rather than doing what they're clearly trying to do, which is to find the next Brexit. Because they've noticed that they got re-elected over in 2019 because of Brexit. So now they're finding the EHRC or something else. But that's a sugar rush high. It doesn't last. You need a fundamental re-understanding of your place in British society, as you did back in the 40s. And I've seen no sign of that, but I think that's the main thing I would tell the Tories, to be honest.
I mean, like, on that, and it kind of goes back to what we originally talked about. Damien Collins saying there are centre-left solutions to problems, there are centre-right solutions to problems. For a long time, I don't think there have been centre-right solutions to contemporary problems. That a big problem the Tories had from 2010, maybe from 2008 onwards, is that just the complete collapse of centre-right political economic thinking, and it sort of got worse over the course of the Tory government and sort of rapid changing in sort of leaders of like I found towards the end of say the Johnson government and then Truss and then Sunak, I remember seeing a great tweet of someone saying conservatism today is the fear that someone somewhere has something they're not absolutely desperate for. I kind of felt like it sort of typified this idea of, weirdly for the Conservatives, of like people shouldn't have disposable income. People should pay their taxes, pay their bills, pay their rent, and be fine with that. Which to me seems like a turning on its head historic Tory economic thinking of giving people more disposable income to spend on luxuries, to have more bandwidth. And it seemed to me that had flipped round, and now you have a sort of husk of Thatcherite thinking, but like the most extreme, the most laissez-faire kind of Thatcherism, and that's it, and that's all they really have to offer, and that's why they need another Brexit, because they don't really know how to talk about housing, how to talk about tax, how to talk about anything else.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'd say is, I think it's a flipping on its head of kind of more modern conservative ideas. But actually, if you go back, way back to the 19th century, I think that would fit in extremely well with conservative thinking back then. I am of the opinion that a lot of what we think of as the kind of aspirational elements of conservatism are basically elements of kind of liberal, via right-wing liberal thought that were kind of put together with conservatism in, well, for various reasons in the 20th century. And Thatcher, especially early on, was actually, from what I can see, very good at making that point of saying, because especially, and again, this is Stephen Bush has mentioned this, and it's very true. There is this tendency in parts of the Labour Party and socialism more broadly towards a kind of miserabilism, a kind of miserable politics, where it's like, in the 50s, I think it was in 55, the Labour manifesto was talking about potentially getting rid of ITV. It's like, oh, why would you need independent entertainment programming? You have BBC. It's that sort of school teacher-ish kind of disciplinarian politics. It's like, no, you can't buy a council house. No, you don't need ITV. You just. And I think, unfortunately, Starmer. I'm not sure whether he necessarily believes this stuff, but he comes across that way, I think, quite a lot. Starmer and Reeves. I think it was John Chase in The Guardian during the budget called Rachel Reeves the angel of death. And like, that's unfair, but I get what he means. There is this very sense of like, there's a sense of that kind of disciplinarian about her, the sort of head teacher who tells you what you can't do, and that's fine. There's a place for that in politics, but you also need a sense of joy, and I don't get that sense in this Labour government from either Starmer or Reeves. Now, Angela Rayner, I think she might have that, and I think she's one to watch absolutely for that. But you don't get the sense of joy from them. And
my joke is, no one's ever made any money underestimating Keir Starmer. Well, maybe Angela Rayner.
yeah, yes, but I think that style, that style of politics is something that the Tories, from what, again, I wasn't there, but from what I can tell from the 70s and 80s, they did a very good job at presenting themselves as the face of aspirational Britain. Not necessarily liberal Britain, but aspirational Britain. People who wanted to get up and get on in life, and who weren't satisfied with the way things are. And again, that's interesting because, again, if you go back, the old conservatism was very much about that. It was about protecting, class and hierarchy interests. I mean, arguably, I'd argue that all conservatism as an ideology is to some extent about like protecting hierarchy. But certainly, it was much more overt. It was much more about, you represent the interests of the landed aristocracy, the gentry, the Church of England, and people should know their place. And it was the liberals who were saying, no, like, we are the up-and-comers, we are the doctors, we are the lawyers, the professional classes, we're the ones who want to make things happen. And I think that, you've ended up weird, because in a weird sort of way, extreme, like, extreme libertarian politics kind of dovetails very nicely with very old school conservatism, because if nobody has any disposable income, there is no way for anybody to actually be able to get on, because everything you're doing is just going towards living and buying your shopping and paying your bills, and that's it. It actually leads to a very hierarchical society. So I do wonder if there's an element here of, and actually I made this point in a Blue Sky thread that you might have seen before, that in a weird way, Brexit, basically since 1886, when you had the Liberal split, the Tory party does not start consistently winning elections until it has this kind of liberal influence. Again, it's in 1886 when you have the coming together of the Liberal Unionists and the Conservatives, which is why it's the Conservative and Unionist Party. And then the Tory party starts actually winning majorities of the vote, pluralities of the vote, majorities. And then again, you get to the 1920s, and again you get the National Liberals coming in, and then again in the 80s, you get the influence of the kind of the Libertarians. In a weird sort of way, I think for the elite of the Tory party, the right wing elite of the Tory party, not for the voters, but for the party. Brexit almost feels to me like an attempt to break that link. Because again, the Tories won because they were able to bring with them enough liberal aspirational voters. Not those are the same thing, but they were able to bring across both enough liberal Tory voters and enough aspirational voters to be able to form a reusable coalition. But there were always elements in the Tory party that were deeply uncomfortable with that. and wanted a much more, not necessarily even autarkic, but a much more hierarchical, a much more old school, a much more, you know, large C conservative outlook. And I think Brexit, for a decent chunk of the Tory party, was an attempt to get that, to repudiate 1886 and to repudiate the liberal influence and to say, no, actually, we want a hardcore conservative government without any of this coalition business. And the problem with that is that that wasn't electorally viable for them as a party. I mean, the problem for that, personally, is I think it's a bad idea. But at an electoral level, it didn't work. And instead, what you've seen is the remains of the Tory party splintering and a resurgent, more right-wing force that's willing to basically just completely supplant it take shape.
Thought I'd end on sort of on that of a lot of the focus and attention has been on Farage and reform for the last several months. Poll highs that for a new party hasn't maybe been achieved since the SDP. Polling recently has shown some slippage. Is the tide receding, or is it just actually settling in a firm place that's going to remain for the next 4 years?
I mean, it's so difficult to know. Partly, I mean, to sort of make this point about time, 4 years ago, not only was Boris Johnson Prime Minister, but he was probably in the strongest position he had ever been in, because that was around the time of the Hartlepool by-election when, the Tories were riding high and Starmer thought about resigning. And so, talking about what's going to happen in 4 years' time is incredibly difficult because, we'd have no idea what the international situation will have looked like. We don't know what the economy will look like. Anecdotally, I'm noticing more people talking positively about the NHS again, which is interesting. I wonder if that's part of a broader trend. But to sort of nevertheless kind of talk about this a little bit. I mean, Farage, it's a difficult one. On the one hand, Farage is someone who very clearly has a genuine appeal. He really does. But I dislike this talk of this new party because sure, Reform is a new party, but it's not a new party. It's the Farage show, and the Farage show has been going since the early 2010s. Again, he got 23% of the vote in the local elections in 2013. He got 27% of the vote in the EU elections in 2014. He got 30% of the vote in the EU elections in 2019, and now he's got 30% of the vote in the local elections in 2025. It's not that I don't think that that's important, and it's not that I don't think that local elections are more important, because I think the EU elections were much more of a protest vote. People do care actually more about local elections, although they are still often seen as a protest vote. But we're not seeing, this isn't a new phenomena. We're seeing the same phenomena repackaged and rebranded over and over again. And one of Farage's, I think, most effective sort of elements as a political operative is his ability to repackage himself over and over and over again to the media and to the public to some extent, and get them to see him as a new thing each time, because he's not. He's the same thing he's been for a while. Again, that isn't to say that he's not important. He's very important now, but this isn't a new thing, and this is why I fundamentally see this. The story to me is not the rise of Reform; it's the collapse of the Tories. That's the main story to me. Because again, this vote splitting, you have a decent chunk of Tory voters who in the 2010s are willing to vote for the Tories at the general election, but vote for Farage at the local and the European elections. That doesn't exist anymore. You've seen those voters go over. They found their party now. They're not coming back. So I think that's a big part of this story, actually, is that it's not so much about Reform's rise by itself. Because the other thing is, I mean, what do we mean by rise? David Cameron got, I think it was 38% of the vote in 2015. I mean, at this point, Reform are just about holding steady on 28% of the vote. This isn't, I mean, it's impressive because it's the single biggest share of the vote. But, I mean, the LibDems were in the low 20s back in 2010, and people weren't talking about them the way that they talk about Reform now. So it's not that I don't think that Reform isn't an important part of this story. It's more that I think, at least as they are now, Reform are a symptom of the decline on the right more than they are a story within themselves. Now, that could change, and I want to make that very clear, because I think that the problem Reform have had up until this point is aside from on immigration in Europe, there really isn't a huge amount to them as a policy offering. They are now changing that. They are talking more about things like nationalisation of the steelworks, Port Talbot steelworks. They're talking about more now, arguably stuff that will alienate, and indeed in my discussion already has alienated potential right-wing voters who are talking about, well, you want to pay for all of this extra spending, but where are you going to get it from? But they are moving towards more of a kind of taking some elements of the centre-left economically. And that's important because, as we know from polling, the biggest untapped market in British politics is people who are economically left but socially right. So, I do think that there is a real opportunity for reform there. So I think for now, I would say that I think reform is, rather than being a story in themselves, are more they are more an effect of the broader collapse on the right than they are the main story themselves. But that could change, and I could see a future where reform gets to 35 to 40% of the vote. I think that would be difficult for them to do, but not impossible. And at that point, I think they really would have set themselves as, for the foreseeable future, as the centre-right party. Because the fundamental problem for all the Farage vehicles is that without Farage, they are nothing. And if you want to actually make a viable long-term centre-right party, which I don't know if Farage does, but if you do, you need an actual party. You can't just have a one-man show. You need a shadow cabinet. You need more of an actual focus on long-term policies and more of a focus on succession as well. And I don't know if Farage really wants that. That's the only reason why I think the Tories might still come back, because I don't know if reform could survive without Farage if he steps down, which isn't necessarily going to be likely, but it's not impossible either.
William, thank you very much.
Thank you.